Pod, the Soccer Shorts companion podcast, where we try to shine a spotlight on stories about local grassroots soccer culture here in our hometown of San Diego, as well as across the US and around the world. I'm John Cross. I'm the founder of Soccer Shorts, and with me tonight, as always, is our co-host, Dylan Wilson. Dylan, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing pretty well. Been a busy day, but made it here. So, yeah, doing all right. How about yourself?
Did that busy day include at all watching Tottenham this afternoon
Yeah, I did my
at
best.
Fair Play?
I was like, no, I was in the middle of a meeting and like trying to get some
Uh,
work done. So I had it on, but I was only half paying attention, unfortunately.
you must be happy though.
Yes,
Got the
yes,
result.
absolutely. Seemed like a pretty boring game, to be honest.
Yeah, well, I didn't get the chance to see any of the matches today. I had some things come up as well, which kind of threw me for a busy day and kind of out of my routine a little bit. So glad I did quite a bit of my planning for the show ahead of time. Otherwise, I really would have been scrambling today. But before we get started, anything else you have to since we last spoke on the podcast last week?
I don't think so. I went to a Wave game recently, but I don't think that was this past weekend. No, that was like a weekend, 2 weekends ago. So, no, I don't think so. Nothing soccer related, anyway.
All right, well, let's jump in for our episode today. Actually, we're going to start with a little correction. On last week's episode, we did a continuation of our talk about the Japanese soccer league structure, their pyramid structure over there, as part of our Pro Rel series. And at one point, I was comparing the 100-year vision that the JFA has compared to US Soccer's Project 2010. And as several of our listeners pointed out to me, I had mentioned that Project 2010 was after the 2002 World Cup. It was actually after the 1998 World Cup, which I knew. I'm not sure why I said after the 2002 World Cup, but I'll blame that on my COVID brain. I routinely find myself confidently saying certain things that are wrong occasionally. But as I went back to relook at Project 2010, I just decided I would. I hadn't looked at the document in a while, as see if I could find it online, which I did, and started skimming through it and realized, there's a lot in here that we could talk about, both in terms of history, of it's part of our soccer history and the background of how Project 2010 even came about in the first place. I think helps put things into perspective of where we are here in 2025, and also some of the legacies, because there were some things from Project 2010 or 2010 that did get put in place that have helped strengthen soccer in this country. But there are also some misses. So I think over the course of multiple episodes, we can periodically revisit this and really get into some detail and talk about what some of those misses are, especially with the World Cup coming up next summer in 2026. Everybody talks about what will the momentum be? What will US soccer be able to capitalize on as they move forward after this World Cup? And that's kind of what the idea behind Project 2010 was, to use some of those proceeds that they had from the 1994 World Cup, and how were they going to strengthen soccer with that original goal of trying to win, or at least put them in a position to win the 2010 World Cup. So we know that didn't happen, but we'll look at in a little more detail as part of the episode today, look at Project 2010, and then we'll come back and revisit some finer details over some other episodes. So that'll be the bulk of our podcast tonight. And then before we do that, as we do always, we'll look at some kind of current news going on. And I don't have anything directly for current events, but we do have some cup news and some lower league news we'll get to. But Dylan, I'm going to toss it to you. Is there anything that stood out current event-wise, stuff going on in the news, especially that might have an impact on grassroots lower league soccer that happened this week?
Well, not happened, but about to happen. I actually touched on this a while back, but I was mistaken in that the semifinals for the Canadian Championship are actually two-legged, and I didn't realize that.
Yes.
The second leg of Vancouver versus Forge FC is at 7 p.m. in just over half an hour. Tied at 2 heading into the second leg. The other semifinal is all non-MLS clubs, which means that if Forge can find a way to win this tie, the Canadian Championship will be won by a non-MLS team for the first time ever. So obviously getting ahead of myself there, but boy, I would love to see that. I think that would be great for Canadian soccer because I think they've seen really an explosion in growth in the last 5-10 years, really. I know we had a couple of Canadians in the locals back in the Loyal days who would talk about some of their, escapades.
Right, and I agree, and I actually I took it off the rundown, but that was something I had in there, and I just decided, well, I don't know if we'll get to it tonight. Maybe we'll see how this semifinal plays out. But yes, Vancouver is the last MLS team left of the Final Four, and Forge have been giant killers this round or this time around, and in previous rounds. They I think, if I remember correctly, they made it to the semifinals. I want to say last year, but maybe it was a couple of years ago. Or I'm sorry, made it to the finals. They were runners up. So we'll have to see if, as you said, if they knock off Vancouver tonight. Now, of course, Vancouver is coming off a gigantic win. And with their new signing, Mueller, we'll see if he plays, what's happening, how seriously Vancouver might take this. But I think for the bigger Canadian soccer picture, it would be nice to see. It would be nice to see a Canadian Cup final that is all Canadian. Is it Canadian Premier League? I'm drawing a blank now.
I think that's what
of all the first division teams from Canada, as opposed to, as you said, Major League Soccer. I mean, in a perfect world for me, I would rather see Vancouver and Toronto and Montreal from MLS play in Canada and help strengthen their league and keep the US league with the US teams. I think it simplifies some things around when you start trying to develop your pyramid, trying to deal with international tournaments. I mean, MLS is always constantly like, how do you figure out who gets CONCACAF berths, because it's done by country. So, and you have teams from different countries playing in your league. But anyway, that's a whole other conversation and potentially a whole other podcast.
Yeah, I would love to talk about the Canadian system sometime. Actually, I think we should put a pin in that one.
We do have that on, and I think soon we will be talking about, because we talked about Japan in our Pro Rel series as a country that started their modern version of Pier 1 around the same time as MLS. So there are a lot of parallels, and we did that those last couple episodes. But Canada is a good one to look at, along with Australia and Brazil and some of these countries that have a huge land mass like the United States does. So how are they trying to tackle an integrated pyramid tied together with promotion relegation with a large country? Because that's always something people bring up in this country. A lot of people will say things like, you can never make it work. And we talked about these absolute comments on the last episode. But you can never make it work because of the geography of our country. And in fact, we're going to talk about that a little bit with Project 2010, because that's something that came up in Project 2010. So we'll talk about that a little later in the episode. But we will turn our attention in our Pro Rel series to some of these larger countries and look at how they're tackling it. So once we really start digging into the US and how it can move forward, we have some more information to draw on. But I agree with you. I think touching on Canada would be, because they've made some huge changes in just the last decade.
Yeah, I think I was going to say it's funny because we talked about Japan, right? Who started at the same time, around thereabouts, and have moved in the direction I think you and I can both say we would have liked US soccer to have gone in. And it's funny because now we're talking about the Canadian system, which started way later and is still probably going to beat us to an actual pyramid. So it's, anyway, we'll get to that conversation when we have it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that'll be a fun one when we get there. But like we said, we'll put a pin in that for right now. But we got on this topic because of the Canadian Cup. So let's talk about some Cup news here. We just had the Club World Cup here over the summer. But to me, the actual true Club World Cup, the rebranded Intercontinental Cup, actually started up last week. So you have we had the first round, which was I don't have it in front of me right now. I thought I'd remember it, but we actually had the first round, which was the I think Asian champion. I don't remember. It was Pyramids FC. They won it in the first round. They'll be moving on. But this is the winners from the most recent Cup competitions, not the crazy formula they used for the 2025 Club World Cup that we had this summer in the United States. The World Cup format that they used. But we had the first round. Second round, I think, is going to be next week. So Pyramids FC will move on to play. I forget which winner now. I'll have to look it up online. But just this is more to let people know that there is still another FIFA World Club Cup going, and this 2025 edition is taking the winners from this very last season and pitting them together like the old Club World Cups used to do. The other match, Cruz Azul is the CONCACAF representative, if I remember correctly, but they're going to have to wait till December to play their match. Because they're waiting for the CONMEBOL champion, and they don't finish their tournament until this November. So end of November, we should know that, and then I think it's December 10th. But as soon as we know those two winners, they'll play, and then that winner should take on PSG later in December, January, sometime around there. But that's coming up. And just what are your thoughts? Like, we just had the Club World Cup, and now we have this Intercontinental Cup. I mean, my feeling is I like this Intercontinental Cup. I wish they'd just keep this and just scrap the old or the new Club World Cup format that they do. I don't like this World Cup style format for the Club World Cup. Now that it's passed and I've had more time to think about it, I really don't love it. And I think I don't love it more because of how do you realistically qualify your teams for it? I mean, it's a crazy collection of teams that end up being in it. Oh, I did remember which other team that Pyramids FC, they beat the Oceania champion. It was Auckland City FC, the same club that was in the Club World Cup.
Yeah, I also kind of come back to the point of not really being a fan. And it's actually funny, it was just this past weekend that it kind of hit me that I really don't like it, especially considering that they do the Intercontinental Cup or what used to be the Cup. I liked that format. It was quick. I thought it was interesting. I noticed Chelsea were wearing their Club World Champion gold badges, and it occurred to me, are they just going to be wearing those for the next 4 years?
4 years
On all of their kits? And it just, when I put it in that context to myself, I was like, that actually is very silly. And so I don't know. I like the old annual format. I thought it was more fun and less, I don't know.
Just take your Confederation winners and have them play, and that's it.
Yeah. Well, and also this was a point made before the tournament, but I think, with some hindsight, it's true. The clubs, especially in the less affluent confederations, the clubs that did compete in this tournament, even the money they got from just participating is going to set them so far ahead of
everybody else.
Right, everybody else in the confederation that they're going to end up qualifying again, and it's going to be a recurring positive feedback loop that is harmful to everybody else. And so, yeah, you do wonder.
Yeah, not a huge fan overall, and that's something I'm sure we'll talk about off and on over the course of the next few years. But just to let people know, that is actually happening. We do have a match next week where Pyramids FC will play. I think they will play the Asian champion because they were the African champion. And then the CONCACAF and CONMEBOL will play each other, and then those two winners will play, and then the winners will play PSG, as I said. So that's coming up over this fall, so I'm sure we'll talk about that a little later on in some of our episodes. But to switch gears back to CONCACAF, I guess, I actually, the board of directors for U.S. Soccer recently had a meeting. I get those alerts, and I usually go back and watch them after they happen, not live when they happen, because then I can, skim through them a lot faster on YouTube. And I didn't do it last week, and I finally did it. And one of the things that, well, two things I found very interesting, that there were some slight connection issues that Don Garber certainly seemed like an excuse to not give his report, because he was the only one coming in remotely.
Sure.
But that was, and that's, could be my bias. I'll fully admit that. But
It
he
is
just seemed eager
mighty
to,
convenient, isn't it?
he seemed eager to just be like, why don't we just move on? I'll just send them in. So I found that disappointing, because I was curious to see what he'd say, because we had NWSL report and USL report out, so the youth ages, there are all these things for the reports. I'm always interested to hear what's happening. I'm a bit of a soccer nerd like that, and especially when it affects, can have a ripple effect out into what's happening through our soccer landscape. But the one thing I heard that was interesting that I hadn't heard yet, forget who mentioned it, but U.S. soccer is currently in looking at trying to strengthen in the United States, amateur programs, because they were talking about the Hank Steinbrecher Cup, and they're talking about the National Amateur Cup and the success of some of those this last year, and how they may shift a couple of the tournaments around. One of the things that U.S. soccer has proposed to CONCACAF is trying to get a CONCACAF amateur club soccer tournament going. And I'm not sure what I think about that. I mean, on the one hand, I think that's kind of cool, but on the other hand, one of the reasons, even just in our own country, that we have trouble getting a fair representation across the country for some of these amateur clubs is the cost of travel. And if they're having trouble traveling from Southern California to Utah for a Region 4 competition, how are they going to be traveling across CONCACAF unless someone else is going to fund this? So I heard that, it was interesting, kind of as an idea, but logistically, I just don't see how that works.
Yeah, that's fair. They would have to be subsidized. That's really the only answer. And so the question then becomes, what would CONCACAF be getting out of this tournament? Why do they feel like they could sell at the amount of advertising needed or whatever to make the amount of money to make it worth their while to subsidize this travel, which I'm going to go ahead and out on a limb and guess they wouldn't be able to do. But I like.
Well, I'm guessing the tournament would be in the United States.
Well, right, but even then, they'd still have to subsidize travel. I like the idea, though. I don't know how feasible it is, but yeah, I mean, I think anything to highlight not sanitized franchise clubs is a good thing. So that's my bias showing through, I suppose, but. You figure if that did come to fruition, like the teams that go far, every single one of those guys' lives are going to change because they're going to have pro offers somewhere, right? So I think in that sense, it would be pretty cool. It would give a stage for people to, seize the opportunity and potentially change their lives. But I think that's only looking at the end product and not all the steps necessary to get there. So.
Yeah, and I think the date to start this at the earliest was sometime in 2027. Certainly, probably trying to carry on from the momentum of the World Cup. But let's switch now to just the United States and the U.S. Open Cup. So we're in that weird phase of overlap where we're wrapping up our 2025 Open Cup, and we've already started qualifying for the actual qualifying tournament for the 2026 U.S. Open Cup. So right now, actually, I just pulled it up on FOTMob here, and Nashville looks like they're up 2-0 over Philly in one of the semifinals for the 2025 Open Cup. Tomorrow we have Minnesota hosting Austin. Any other than just kind of reporting out that we're in the semifinals, and any thoughts on the 2025 U.S. Open Cup? I know we're both kind of lost interest. Might be a fair assessment. Might be a little harsh. I don't know. Just it's MLS teams and they're at the end.
Yeah, super excited for the 2026 Open Cup. I think is my thoughts on that. Yeah.
All right. But yes, we've started the 2026 qualifying tournament. Round 1 was last weekend. So we have a whole slew of winners that are moving on to round 2. We mentioned last week also that all 4 San Diego teams, they had buys for the first round. So they will jump in here in the second round. I have heard, I can't remember where, but the draw for round 2 is supposed to take place sometime before the end of this week. I checked today to see if I could find any information, and I didn't find any updates anywhere other than just updates of the results of the first rounds, but not draws and who's hosting games. So hopefully by next week, we should know where our San Diego teams are playing and maybe start making some plans for some matches we can encourage people to get out and see locally. Sometimes some teams that could qualify for next year's U.S. Open Cup.
Sorry, I was reading something. I totally missed that there. I apologize.
No, that's fine. So we'll leave that there because we'll pick that up on next week for the U.S. Open Cup, and then the USL Cup. The Jägermeister Cup final is set. We had the semifinals last week. Sacramento.
That I'm a lot more interested in. Yes.
Yeah, Sacramento squeaked by Rhode Island in penalty kicks, and then
that was a brutal game.
Hartford.
The Hartford game wasn't
I saw
great.
some highlights.
Yeah, once Hartford went ahead, I think they was kind of like they just managed to kind of sit back and take advantage of that. Which whatever, fair play. It wasn't that exciting of a game though, but the Rhode Island game, Koke had an amazing game, but his team let him down in the penalty shootout.
Couldn't score.
They literally didn't score one. So
yeah, that was hard done for them, especially because we have some former loyal players on Rhode Island. I mean, more and more it just spread out across the league. But Hartford, I mean, that's got to be one of the surprises over the course of the USL Championship season, because Hartford was pretty much at the bottom, and they have really started to come on a lot stronger here towards the close of the season. And that'll be interesting. Sacramento will be hosting the final. It'll take place Saturday, October 4th at 7 p.m. It'll be broadcast on the Golazo network. So
I believe that was just a random draw for hosting rights, correct?
Yes, it was a random draw. That was the reason Sacramento is hosting. No other reason than a random draw. So set your calendars for that. That's coming up in a couple weeks. And I agree with you. I'm much more excited to see that one. Slightly disappointed in some ways that Greenville didn't make it through. But should be a good match. And it's a trophy. It's a cup competition, and hopefully, in its second year, we've seen some of the changes they did in format with the 7 new teams coming in to League One next year. At least 7 identified now. It's probably only going to be those 7, but 7 teams coming into USL One will really change the dynamic of the tournament. If the championship keeps 24 teams and you have 21 in League One, it'll be interesting to see how they reformat the tournament for next year.
Yeah. I have to say, especially here in San Diego lately, the town has been abuzz with MLS. But when I talk to people who know about things beyond MLS vis-a-vis U.S. soccer, their reaction is literally always, "I'm just glad they're doing this cup. It's cool that they're doing this.
Yeah,
I'm glad it's happening. I hope they keep doing it." And so that's where I'm at. Back when we started, that we talked about the weird format. I think we both kind of agreed. The important thing with this year is doing it, getting it done,
right.
Having a winner who lifts the trophy. That's all you need to do. So I'm super glad we've gotten to that point, or not quite, almost there.
Right.
And I'm excited to see what more teams, what they could do to make it a less chaotic format, because I do think that kind of detracted from the excitement of the first, like the group stage, especially considering almost none of the games ever were being played at the same time of like teams in the same
Right.
group, right? It made it hard to like give a crap about the group stage. So hopefully that changes going forward.
Yeah, I agree with that, and we'll see coming up for the championship game. But sticking in USL news, some updates in terms of expansion and ownership groups. There is that new club starting in Dallas, which is really interesting because there's an MLS team in Dallas, and this is going to be the first time I think that USL is entering a market that has an existing MLS team, like directly into the same market. The news, though, is Kyle Martino becomes just the latest former MLS player that has, signed on with a USL ownership group. He becomes part of this Atletico Dallas ownership group. But we're seeing this trend of a lot of former national team players and MLS players that are starting to become owners in USL teams, which I think is a great trend, and it could only
Yeah,
bring
100%.
added experience for those clubs as they are, and contacts, right? Experience and contacts for those clubs that they are trying to develop, and strengthen what's going on at USL on the men's side for these ones that we're talking about in particular.
Yeah, I'm very curious to see how this Atletico Dallas thing pans out. For a couple of reasons. But first, I want to say I'm not crazy about the name or the badge. The hyper realistic badge is like very weird to me. Ajax have done that too with their recent rebrand this year, like Ajax Amsterdam. I don't really get it, but then again, I think that if you showed a lot of the badges that I like to people from 30 years ago, they'd have been like, I don't really get it. So whatever, that doesn't really matter. The thing I'm really interested about, though, with this is that they're playing at the Cotton Bowl Stadium, which, first I'll say, is way too big for a USL League One. It's a 92,000 seater stadium.
Yeah.
That's huge. That said, though, it actually is in Dallas, and it's not very far from what you would call downtown Dallas. There's a lot of, housing and like residential areas in the nearby area, and it's most importantly not a cavernous hole of a stadium out in fucking Frisco. And I have never been to Dallas, but I do look at a lot of maps, and I think it's hard to overstate how not in Dallas FC Dallas are. It's very much a like San Francisco 49ers situation where they actually play like 40 miles south in Santa Clara. Like, by no stretch of the imagination, other than if you're considering it like the metropolitan area, and even then it's like outer ring metro area, by no stretch of the imagination is Frisco like in the city of Dallas. So I do wonder if the casual like fan or the family looking for a sporting night out might not only see the lower prices that are bound to come with USL, but also the less than 45-minute drive each way, you figure, depending on where they're coming from. So I do wonder if Atletico Dallas might actually benefit from that kind of dynamic as far as capturing the casual, the family looking for a weekend night out, right? Like those sorts of things. And that can be all the difference maker in American sports, right? That's like, those are the ones you're looking for. So, yeah, I don't know. I will keep an eye on that one, even though I don't really care about Dallas sports whatsoever.
Yeah. Do you know off the top of your head, because I don't remember, but is the Cotton Bowl being used for anything regularly? Like, is there any team that's using it?
Let me have a look at that real quick. I know because it's right. It's just the Cotton Bowl Classic in like January or whatever for college football. But other than that, I don't think there's any other current tenants.
I'm curious if a longer term plan to all of this might, and this will tie into our next story, if a longer term plan for this might be a redevelopment of that Cotton Bowl site. I have no idea. I don't live in Dallas. I don't know if that's even been conversations. But the next topic we're going to talk about leads me to believe that if they're going there, that could be a possibility.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that. There are no current regular tenants that are not soccer teams. The only other regular tenant, according to Wikipedia, is Dallas Trinity, who are the USL Super League team in Dallas.
Oh yeah, so
The
another
women's
soccer
side.
team. Okay.
Right, the women's
Yeah.
side. Who you wonder if maybe it's the same ownership group. I actually don't know. But they're playing at the same stadium. They're both part of USL. Wouldn't be surprising if they're at least like cooperative ownership groups.
Okay, so let's jump into our next story because now this I think to me really fed the soccer trolls of the people who complain whether it's MLS or USL that it's nothing more than a real estate play. And and I get it. When you see a story like this, USL has announced that they've created a pre-development agreement and partnership with the town of Firestone. Now, Firestone's in Colorado. It's about 30 minutes north of Denver. And in the article on the USL website, there's no talk about an ownership group or anything else, but plans to build a soccer stadium along with this redevelopment area that a team could play in. And they have this agreement with the United Soccer League. So I think that's where I saw a lot of buzz about that. And I mean, that's a whole other conversation we can have, obviously, on a different podcast. But I don't see a problem with this in general because you need a place to play, you need redevelopment. But the only way you're going to get a stadium is if it is mixed in with some other kind of redevelopment. There's not land to build in a lot of places, just a new stadium anymore. So that part doesn't bother me.
Yeah,
But I'm going to let you jump in, and then I have
sure,
a
sure.
totally different thing that I'm very concerned about this thing.
Well,
This move.
I guess I'll see what you have to say about it. But I would argue that worrying that it's a real estate venture is kind of missing the forest for the trees, because when you consider the counterfactual, like that is what actual football clubs do. Like, let's take Tottenham, for example. The redevelopment of that stadium, which they own, understanding there's bank loans and whatnot, that's their source of income, not tickets or whatever, the stadium, right? Like the fact that they own that land and that stadium. So I think that the idea that clubs shouldn't seek to have some sort of like real estate angle is a little bit like naive, I guess. And it's also shaped by my next point, which is the tradition in America, which is where the taxpayers fucking foot the bill. And so
Yes.
it's like, yes, when you like just in a vacuum think of a football club as a real estate venture, it's like, ew, that feels gross. But when the other option is the taxpayer is paying for it, it's like, well, actually, I think that's, I guess what I'm trying to say is I think that's kind of a decidedly negative framing of something that's more complex than that.
Right. Yeah, I agree. And I think it's especially when people are having these league versus league wars and trying to put one league down over another league or make justifications. And I I understand why people make those arguments. My concern with this is Firestone, as we said, 30 miles north of Denver, which is about halfway to Windsor, which is where the Northern Colorado Hailstorm play,
And
which
they have
just
folded.
very
Right.
recently
Yeah.
were part of League One, got kicked out of League One. And we don't need to go into all the details about that. Still kind of around, maybe playing in Nisa, last I heard. But this to me strikes very similar to what we saw happen with the Chattanooga Red Wolves. You know, a team coming in, or USL planting a team basically in Chattanooga to really compete against Chattanooga FC. And this concerns me because this is one of the things that I hate about this league versus league competition that US soccer maybe promotes is not the right word, but certainly doesn't dissuade because we don't have another way of handling things. That a club can't just be a club, and leagues are structured around that clubs can move around between leagues, how, you know, hopefully through promotion relegation, but more it's like IP ownership of leagues and controlling clubs. And I'm concerned, maybe it has nothing to do with it, but just looking at the optics on the surface, this strikes me very much like USL imposing the Chattanooga Red Wolves in Chattanooga, which then prevented, when CFC was looking for a new league, them, because of the market restrictions and everything else the USL has, that Chattanooga FC couldn't come into USL and then went to MLS Next Pro. And this is one of my concerns with this move. We've established an agreement and we don't even have a team to play there yet.
That's fair. Yeah, I hadn't considered that. Definitely had hoped they'd learned their lesson from that situation, but kind of sounds like maybe not if that's where they're going.
Yeah, I think my personal thought is they really need to get rid of these territorial rights.
Well,
There's a
I
lot of
kind
things I'd like to see changed, but that's the very first thing I would like to see them get rid of.
Well, and maybe I was just reading the tea leaves a little too much, but it seemed like that was the direction they were going in. But maybe not. I don't know.
Yeah, and I don't know. I'm looking at this on the surface, and that would be a concern I would have. Yeah. And rightfully so. I could see MLS people saying, well, USL's doing the exact same thing that MLS does. And in this case, if that's what's happening, I would 100% agree. And I think they're both wrong. They both shouldn't be doing that kind of stuff. But we'll see. I mean, whatever happened with Northern Colorado hailstorm with the owners and all of that and why they were kicked out of the league, I really hate to see teams or get squeezed out completely.
Can you give like a quick 30-second overview of what happened there? Because I had assumed they had just voluntarily dipped out because they didn't have the finances. I didn't realize that was an enforced thing.
I mean, I want to be careful what I say because I need to go back and look at it. I don't want to make a mistake. But I know there were some conflicts because they won the USL Cup last year.
Right.
I know there was a concern about they felt they didn't get their winnings from that. Oh. And if I remember correctly from USL, that they were not meeting the requirements, as a club to stay in USL.
I see.
And there was some back and forth between the two of them as to how that played out. But bottom line, they're out of League One and they're kind of they're still together basically as a club and looking for a place to play and that kind of stuff. Again, I don't know all the details, but I hate when if we had a better structure and someone wasn't meeting the requirements, then they get relegated to the league below, right? That's what happens instead of being kicked out.
Or you can send them into administration or something, right? Which will then
yeah, but not this. Now you're kind of barred from participating in the league. That's where I think we have the league and the control that leagues have in this country. I really dislike that portion of it. Now, I think the flip side you would argue is, well, that's how the league can help ensure the success of, well, I think the only thing you can argue is the success of the league, not necessarily the success of individual clubs, because put them on the field and let them keep playing and give them a system to work their way up, and your best clubs will rise to the top. The best managed, the best on the field, all those things will come together if you give them the right environment. Otherwise, then the league is controlling what's happening. For better or for worse.
Yeah. It's one of the great ironies of American society, in my opinion, because promotion and relegation, in theory, should be the most American thing ever. It is literally capitalism distilled into sport. And yet we somehow have mental gymnastics ourselves into thinking that this literal communist system that is closed league sports is somehow more capitalist because people are making money hand over fist. Anyway, that is a whole other tangent, but it's always been one of the funniest things about American society.
Yeah. All right. To wrap up our lower league news, just as a reminder, if anybody hasn't been following, you can find it on YouTube, but it's called The Experience. It's a docu-series done by an independent group up in Portland for the Portland Hearts of Pine. And it I probably like it personally because it reminds me of me and what I did with the locals when just being there from the very beginning and filming. And it's the same kind of thing. You had a group that kind of got wind of this starting and just asked, hey, could I be there and start filming? I want to document this. They weren't sure what was going to happen with it or what they were putting together. But they've been putting together this docu-series throughout the season. They just dropped an episode recently. I haven't seen the latest one. I've seen quite a few of the episodes, and I think if you were a fan of the SD Loyal, there's a lot of things you will see in this, and the way this ownership group has approached building a team and connecting with the community in Portland, Maine, will really resonate with you if you were very involved with supporter group culture or following SD Loyal around that same time period. I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for, but it makes me miss all the experiences we had with the San Diego Loyal, but at the same time, super happy to see other places around the country really being able to embrace and have that same experience and really thrive with, I'll tell you, almost every time Portland, Maine hosts a match for League One, I will try to watch it because of the fan environment. It's a full stadium. It's not very many people. The soccer's not fantastic, but it's fun. It feels like a soccer match that has some kind of meaning to it. And otherwise, there's some other teams that are playing some really good soccer right now in League One and the championship, but their stadium atmosphere is dull as can be. And I think there's a lot of clubs just in general who could learn a lot from just watching this docu-series. So I'm just putting a plug out there. It's called The Experience. It is about Portland Hearts of Pine. And you can find it on YouTube. But I think it's pretty good. So if you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, you should check it out.
Oh, yeah, I'll give that a look. The Experience, yeah?
Yep.
Like, the definite article is part of the title, not just like, yeah, okay, anyway. Sometimes that can, anyway, it doesn't matter. YouTube's algorithm isn't great, that's all I'm saying.
Right. Okay, well, that brings us to our main topic for tonight, Project 2010. And, we mentioned this last episode, as I said, in the opening of this podcast, and, I had the incorrect dates on there. But one of the reasons I thought we should dive a little deeper into Project 2010 is because it did have some impact on our soccer culture here over the last 25-ish years. And at least from a historical perspective, we should take a look at it. We should also kind of see, especially with the World Cup 2026 coming up in the summer, we should look at, what worked well in the plan, where did the plan kind of go sideways and why, and what could we learn, especially if there is any kind of financial windfall for U.S. soccer after this 2026 World Cup. How could they use that and the momentum from everybody's interest to try to help move the sport forward in this country? Because that's part of what Project 2010 was doing. It really had a very much more specific goal, which we'll get into in a second. But I mean, that was an underlying part of it, was to help build soccer in this country. So, Dylan, I know I had sent you something. I think I sent you a link to the actual document and stuff, and I don't know if you had time to look at it at all. But as this is U.S. soccer is basically Moonshot, right? That's the imagery they're even using in this. If you look at the cover of Project 2010, that's the astronaut on the moon and talking about how they can win a World Cup or try to give them a realistic shot at winning a World Cup by 2010. So this is in 1998. How in 12 years could U.S. men's team be a realistic contender to win a World Cup? And part of that was using proceeds from the 1994 World Cup. Like $50 million really was dedicated as part of this bigger plan for, all right, let's create a plan for how to spend this money and reinvest back into, well, not just the program, but soccer in general. So I don't know if you had a chance to read it or if you have any general thoughts before we really kind of jump into some of the background of how this Project 2010 was actually created.
I didn't go through the whole document. I did skim it. But in the thing that really jumped out to me when in my just kind of research about it, I didn't know that it was based on a report written by Mr. Carlos Manuel Brito Leal de Quiros, who better known as Carlos Quiros,
Right.
got his, made his name as an assistant coach for Alex Ferguson at United. I know him best because he was the head coach for Portugal when I started to really get into football around 2008, 2010. And then he coached Iran for almost 10 years. And in my high school days, which was right in that zone, I had a buddy who was Persian, and he was a big Iranian national team fan. And so I was always aware of what they were doing. And he had a really, team full of stars. Some of the most prolific scorers and most capped players in Iranian national team history played under that Quiros team. So it was kind of a trip to open up some history and see that name there, because I hadn't thought about him in a while. But that was cool to go down that rabbit hole and read about his history a little bit.
Yeah, if I remember, this report also, I think, is referred to as the Q report.
The Q report.
Or Quiros, So, but this idea of, and really, I think it was more this Q report, if I remember correctly, was really commissioned, which then was the springboard and kind of tied together for this idea of Project 2010. Like, how can we take what we learned here and let's set a goal? And that's, they kind of go together here. But sometimes you'll hear it referred to as the Q report as well. All right, well, let's jump into some backstory, because I think, and that's mostly what we're going to cover in this particular podcast, is kind of how we got to Project 2010. We'll do a little overview once we get to the end of this backstory, but we'll save really diving in to some of the nitty gritty of this for some future episodes. But I think understanding how this project came about and how it was shaped and the people who shaped it is really telling for where we are today in 2025. I think we have so many soccer fans in this country now that became soccer fans maybe from 2002 on, maybe even later, 2010 on. And these names that some people here will be familiar, some people, those names may not be familiar at all. But I think once you understand their roles and where they came from and how things came together, some of the things that how U.S. soccer has turned out makes a lot more sense. Not that it's right, and not that I, for me personally, agree with everything that happened, but you can understand why it happened if you understand the history a little bit. So let's jump into, we'll do this in small chunks. So our first little chunk we're going to do is for this backstory is between 1978 and 1984. We'll kind of look at what was going on in U.S. soccer at the time. So 1978, the Los Angeles was awarded the 1984 Summer Olympics, which was huge for our country. But those Olympics in particular were probably the moment there was a fundamental shift in live sporting events around the world, in this country, and definitely for the Olympics. Because prior to 84, most Olympics were kind of state sponsored. The government would invest in new stadia or new facilities for particular cities, or those cities would, and they would benefit those locations where the Olympics took place. In 84, Los Angeles had a lot of the infrastructure already. There was not public will to be using taxpayer money to fund the Olympics, or, whether it's in LA locally or the state of California or nationally. So Peter Uberoth, who was hired as the the person to lead the 84 Olympics, one of the things he chose to do, besides all the corporate sponsorship, like that was the big like change. And I remember growing up at that time, I was in high school, getting ready to start my senior year, I guess, in 84. So I remember those Olympics very well. And I remember the lead up because you saw these commercials all the time. And like every team was sponsored by someone. Like 7-Eleven was sponsoring one of the US teams that were competing and or groups, and US Mail, and like just all these different people were, it was crazy with sponsorship. A lot of people hated it, this corporate influence in sport.
Huh.
And again, I think this was a huge, huge turning point. Go ahead. What were you going to say?
Oh no, I was just laughing at where that's gone and how those people might feel now, 50 years later.
Oh yeah, there were a lot of people who were upset, kind of losing the more amateur feel of what an Olympics were. But they were hugely successful. I mean, when you look back on it, in terms of attendance and in terms of the business end of it, you didn't have a city or a state or a country even lose a ton of money for putting on the Olympics. So if you look at it through that lens, through a business lens, they were highly successful. And Peter Uberoth decided one of the things to help spread out how to do this was to bring in people to be the commissioner of each sport. So for soccer, Allen Rothenberg was tagged to be the commissioner for soccer. And Allen Rothenberg's an interesting character. We should do a deeper, I mean, we could do a deeper dive, but there's tons of stuff out there you can find on Allen Rothenberg, and we're going to cover some of that here in a second. But he had some history with the NASL, ownership in LA, so he was tapped for soccer. 84 Olympics were, for soccer even, were hugely successful. Sold out stadia, sold out matches. It was good competition. The US fared well. People were super happy, and FIFA, who was also kind of watching this, were concerned coming into the 84 Olympics on how the soccer side of it would go. But it ended up being massively successful. So actually, I should back, I kind of jumped ahead, but we're there for the 84 Olympics, and that was successful. And Allen Rothenberg was huge on the soccer side of making that portion as successful as it was. An attorney, had great connections, I think by most accounts a bit ruthless when it comes to his dealing, but was good at getting corporate sponsors in and other people and bringing people together. Right before the Olympics, though, in 1983, FIFA pulls the Men's World Cup from Colombia. So it's open for someone else to host. The only three countries that put in bids are Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And, they have to make a quick decision because it's coming up in 3 years. They usually, choose this like 6 years ahead of time. So FIFA decides, and I think there's a lot of debate about what was meant there. And again, another potential podcast we can go in to look at this bid process. But FIFA decides automatically just rule out Canada and the United States. And I think a lot of people would argue they just didn't think Canada or the US could seriously pull it off, and there weren't enough serious soccer people in the US. So Mexico was chosen without much, debate or anything else. It's just pretty much the other two are eliminated. Mexico's left. Mexico picks and hosts arguably one of the most interesting World Cups ever in '86. But the following year, when the Olympics happened and soccer was so successful, that really opened the eyes of FIFA. And FIFA's like, well, maybe we could do a tournament in the United States. Maybe this could work. And also on the US side, maybe this could work. So in '84, also before we have the Olympics, Werner Fricker was elected the newest president of U.S. soccer. He had been a vice president for a long time, and was involved in trying to bring the World Cup through this bid process. So he becomes president in '84. We have the Olympics. huge organization. But at the end of 84, the NASL folds. So we kind of have two things happen. We have all this momentum in terms of a big event that is highly successful, but our one professional league, which also, again, we'll cover on another podcast, NASL had a lot of friction and back and forth with FIFA for a lot of things they did. The NASL folds, so now the U.S. is left without a true first division men's league. So we'll pause there for a second. I'll give you a chance to jump in, Dylan, and then we'll cover the next kind of lead up to this Project 2010.
Yeah, I mean, this is mostly new information for me. This is not kind of what I found when I was doing my research, but then again, I kind of ended up going down the Carlos Quiros rabbit hole. I will say, was it Warner Flicker? That's quite a name.
Werner, Werner.
Werner Flicker. I'm gonna have to remember that one. Anyway, I don't have any other thoughts on that. That's quite a name.
Okay. All right, so let's jump into our next section of our backstory, and we'll cover from kind of leaving 1984, where we just were, through 1990. So after the huge success of the 84 Olympics, USSF, and in their attempt to land the 86 World Cup because of Colombia's withdrawal, they start, I mean, it's too late for the 90 World Cup, so they're setting their sights on the 94 World Cup. And Werner Fricker, with his connections, he's German-American, and he really tries to help work the system to bring the bid to, or write the bid to bring the World Cup to the U.S. So that's kind of where we are immediately after in 84. Also in 1985, just to bring another name into the fold, a very young Sunil Gulati at 25 is asked to run the U.S. men's national team camp, right? So this is, we want to qualify, getting ready for the 90 World Cup. So we have a national team camp that we're putting together. And this is a totally wild story that we'll have to get into another time of how he even got involved at 25, is asked to run the national team camp. But I think at this time, U.S. Soccer is not the organization it is today. I mean, it's literally, as Gulati will tell you in interviews that he's done, it's like call someone up and say, hey, I want to help you with this, or hey, I think you're doing it wrong. And someone says, then show me what you can do better. And people get involved. Right. And this is what we start to see a lot in the 70s and the 80s, and people just kind of cold calling and working their way into the system. So Sunil Gulati, another name there, but at 25, he's starts to get more heavily involved at the national level. He was already involved at his state level in Connecticut. In 1988, as Werner Fricker was president, the U.S. does get awarded the 94 World Cup. And one of the people who helped write that bid is someone by the name Scott Letelier. Another interesting person we should go into on another podcast for history. But he helped write the bid, and we get awarded the 94 World Cup. The condition from FIFA was, we're provisionally granting this to you, because I think FIFA started to see dollars, right on the wall, like, oh God, look, if you run a tournament like this and get the right people, like this is a moneymaker. The condition was you had to have a Division I soccer league in place by 1992. Right? So by the summer of 98, just a few months after being awarded the bid, the Fricker plan comes out. It's written by Scott Letelier and a young Sunil Gulati, who's about 28 at this time. And it's 18 pages long. You can find samples of it online, but it details a 3-tiered professional pyramid tied together with promotion and relegation. It's a loose plan, not a highly detailed plan, but there's detail in there, and it was kind of divided into 3 components. The first component is the immediate effect, qualify for the 90 World Cup. So, right, we're 1988 right now. So qualify for the 90 World Cup. That was the very short-term vision. The medium-term vision was get your professional league established and everything ready by the 94 World Cup. And the third part was build out the grassroots program to help support your professional league because you're having a pyramid, right? This is where we were in 1988. This was the plan put forth on paper. Now, the problem with Werner Fricker was he was gruff German and didn't care about making friends. He was not a schmoozer, right? He did not glad hand.
Wait,
He just wanted to go about the business.
Charm? Yeah. What?
He just wanted to go about the business of building soccer in this country. He didn't want to deal with the marketing, the business, that kind of stuff. However, FIFA had their eyes set on someone who did, and that was Allen Rothenberg, because he put on a great 84 World Cup, already had some soccer ownership experience, and they really tapped him like, well, this is the guy we think should be running the World Cup, and this is the guy we think should be running for president of U.S. Soccer. So in 89, we have Paul Caligiuri's shot heard around the world in Trinidad and Tobago. We qualify for the 90 World Cup. We break our 50-year drought. We get there in 1990. And also in 1990, we have our next election for president of U.S. Soccer. And Werner Fricker, probably by most accounts, is not terribly liked. Might be effective at what he's done, but also might not be the right man for taking U.S. soccer to the next stage. But a lot of people see Allen Rothenberg as, and FIFA certainly does, because they want the big tournament and the success in 94. So FIFA backs Rothenberg. Rothenberg wins U.S. soccer presidency in 1990, and we're going to pause there and kind of pick up from, to let you jump in with any comments and then pick it up from Rothenberg's presidency for like the next 8 years and lead us right up to Project 2010.
No, I mean, this is, like I said, this is all mostly new to me. And a lot of names I haven't really heard before, a couple I'm familiar with. But it's, I guess, a little disheartening to know that there was literally a plan to have a system that would be better than the one we have, and we just didn't, for a reason I'm assuming you're about to tell me. So,
yep.
That is probably money, but I'm guessing, there will be a slightly more detailed explanation.
Yeah, slightly more detailed, but you're spot on, right? Really spot on. So let's jump in to 1990 to 1998 to take us right up to the plan. So we had FIFA backed Allen Rothenberg to become the U.S. soccer president. He gets appointed as chair of the FIFA World Cup Committee for 1994. And then in 1993, as well, in this lead up, right, we're trying to figure out how to do a Division I league. And this is also another podcast we could probably do historically. But the short version of all this is, with Rothenberg's experience with the NASL and with his trying to build an ownership group to come together to build, and again, Rothenberg is, to me, big on show and doing an event and have these connections. Part of that agreement of pulling these owners together, of making this work, was how do we protect these owners from just losing a ton of money? And that's where single entity is born and all the other things that come together to create Major League Soccer. And the Fricker plan is just kind of pushed off to the side, and promotion and relegation. If you read back to some of the articles, Rothenberg says it was discussed. They considered it. The phrasing that I've seen Rothenberg use is the U.S. soccer fan is not used to promotion relegation, and they didn't think it would fly. I think what really happened is owners weren't really ready to fly with promotion relegation. You mean I could invest? Like all the things we hear in the arguments against pro-rel, right? We hear this all the time from people saying that. And I think those were, if you're asking a group of people to come together to start this who aren't familiar but have the money, I get it. I get why you would throw that out if you're Allen Rothenberg. And I get like your task is just to really get this started. So you're there to get this started. I don't think Allen Rothenberg, to me, my interpretation, was looking at the 50-year down the road vision of where this could be. Allen Rothenberg was looking at, I need to get this going now. Our typical American short term, flip it, get it going as soon as possible, and how can we be as successful as possible right away? And I think these are some of the pillars, some of the things that happened in the 90s that set the tone for what Major League Soccer was going to be, and also set the tone for the absence of adult soccer outside of MLS, because of some of the choices that were made and some of the choices even within Project 2010 as we get into that. So in 1993, MLS gets established. We know they didn't start playing till 96, but as a league, it gets established. We start having owners. They start, figuring out team names and building brands, doing all the things that they do, have their single entity structure. But Allen Rothenberg is instilled as the chairman of the board of governors. So you have Allen Rothenberg that's the president of U.S. Soccer. He is the head of the World Cup organizing committee, and he is the chairman of the board of governors of Major League Soccer. One man in charge of all three big major things going on in the early 90s for U.S. soccer. The World Cup comes in, to this day, still the best attended World Cup. It earns U.S. soccer, all told, something like more than $60 million in proceeds that they get, that now they got to figure out how to use this and reinvest it into soccer in the U.S. Now, and we'll see as we do just an initial look into the report here today, not a super deep dive. We qualified in 90. We had a bunch of college kids and competed. We were there. Had that game against Italy that everybody refers back to, and then in 94, we had some success. We beat Colombia and we advanced out of our group for the first, well, not for the first time in modern times, the modern structure. But, we advance out of our group and hugely popular, successful, as we said, World Cup, tons of money. And we got to figure out how to reinvest it to make soccer better. So, before we get into that part of the plan, one of the takes us to 98, which will be the next World Cup. Before we start there, I'll let you jump in, and we'll get to the year of 98, where we've got both a World Cup and this plan, and then kind of what comes from it.
I did not know. I mean, I kind of knew that. I was aware of like the owner's influence on the formation of the MLS and kind of how that shaped U.S. soccer going into the new millennium. I didn't know that the stated reason was that y'all are too stupid to understand doing this a different way, which just makes me like think of how political, like it's small p political, that fight must have been within U.S. soccer, because that is the exact kind of shit you hear in like large P politics. Like, we're not going to do this good thing because y'all are too stupid to understand how it works. When, like, don't get me wrong, like, as George Carlin once said, think about how stupid the average person is, and then remember that half of all people are stupider than that, and he's right. But I feel like when people say things like that, it's, I don't know, maybe the fact that so many people just accept that as a reason, like, means they're right. I don't know. It feels so goddamn condescending, and it's just hard to, like, it's one thing to, like, do this because money. It's another thing to, like, do this because money and then pretend it's my fault for being an idiot. It's like, I don't know.
Right. And I think, to me, it's a little telling that this seems more like the owners were not comfortable with it.
Oh,
but no one's
100%.
willing to say the owners are not comfortable with it. So you put it out on, well, the American sports fan wouldn't go for this. But we saw through the early days of MLS the attempt to Americanize the game, which eventually MLS finally pulled back from and got in line with everybody else, because you know, again, it's these owners who think, well, we got to capture the average fan who doesn't know anything about it, so we got to make it like other sports, rather than just trusting the whole reason this sport is as successful as it is around the entire world is because what everybody else is doing works. You don't have to Americanize it for an American audience. And frankly, we are a nation of immigrants. So, you know,
I
it's
do
not the
think
same kind of problem. Go
I
ahead.
do think that there is something to this dynamic that kind of comes from the toxic, well, I say toxic side. The whole thing is toxic. That comes from the American exceptionalism dynamic,
Right.
which is that like we know how to do everything better, right? And I think I first realized this when I don't even remember. It must have been like Twitter, Reddit, one of those stupid things. Like when I was younger and thought it was worth my time arguing on the internet. And somebody, we were talking about sports and their outreach to the world, and I mentioned that soccer is the world's game. Like how can you compete with that in terms of popularity?
Yeah.
And the response from these people, I don't remember what sport they were arguing in favor of, but it doesn't really matter, was like, oh, well, soccer is just popular because all you need is a ball so poor people can play it. It's like, whoa, 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 hold on, pause. Soccer's popular because all you need is a ball. That is true. That's why poor people play it. What? Like that is, and I'm not saying that every like American when they think of soccer thinks of it that way, but I think that's illustrative of kind of the way that we as Americans like view the rest of the world.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I think that's where it kind of comes from, right? Like America, and there's also that dynamic in business where like if you're not growing, you're dying, right? Like if you're not innovating, you're falling behind, which that's a whole other conversation. But it's very American to try and like change a working formula, and I think too that, and I guess the point I was trying to get at is like I think the idea that like, oh, we could appeal to the average fan by making this more like American sports. It's like, well, oh, the rest of the world can't possibly like this because it's interesting. Like they must like
Yeah.
it because they're the poors or uneducated or whatever. And so yeah, you see it. It's one of those things where once you start to see it in society, it's kind of hard not to see it. Also in sports.
Agreed. Yes. All right. Well, we'll get back and let's jump in at 1998 because this is the year we get the plan. So in January of 1998, you get, I'll have to do this from memory because I feel like I misplaced my note here. But in January of 1998, Allen Rothenberg, Sunil Gulati, and I think it was Hank Steinbrecher, they decide to commission Carlos Queiroz and Dan Gasper, who was goalkeeper coach, who had worked a lot with Carlos Queiroz around the world as well, so they knew each other very well. But to commission the two of them to write a report, this Q report that worked into Project 2010, to kind of to figure out how we can do better at the World Cup. Really, that was the primary goal, right? And that's Project 2010. How can we put ourselves to be an actual force that we would be considered one of the likely candidates to win the 2010 World Cup. So that was commissioned in January. In the summer, we have the 1998 World Cup in France. And the U.S. finishes 32nd out of 32 teams, right? Like they did horrible. I just absolutely horrible. Now, there are a whole bunch of reasons. If you know any of the history, again, I don't want to get sidetracked into all this, but the Harks Winalda thing and Steve Sampson's, Harks captain for life. And there was some drama behind the scenes happening with players that kind of sabotaged our chances. But, among other things, and, things just happen sometimes. Sometimes you win games and sometimes you don't at World Cups. So, and how you ultimately finish, because we've had very good teams get knocked out in group stages. They just didn't. They had 3 poor games. So, and we did. We had 3 poor games and we're out. So we finished dead last of all the teams. I remember we had a big match, and that went against Iran, and that was a big thing, and they beat us 2-1, deservedly. And we
deservedly on and off the pitch.
Yeah, we did not go well. The report, though, comes out just after the World Cup. And if you read the report, and we'll put a link to the report in the show notes if anybody wants to check it out, there's an opening letter there from Carlos Queiroz. It runs for several pages, kind of his letter to the whole organization of like, hey, here's the report, here's what's coming. And he talks about some of the things in there. And the goal is to strengthen, like, how do we strengthen the national team, deepen the national team pool, prepare players to compete on an international stage, really is the ultimate goal. And they're looking at things, as he says in the letter, they're looking at our human resources. Like, how do we need to get better at the people we have within the organization? How do we do better with our financial resources? How do we do better with our structure and systems across the organization, equipment and facilities, and just in general, the overall planning within the organization? Because really, during Allen Rothenberg's tenure, there was a complete change in the organization from, I think it still has this, but really it was kind of a good old boy network before Allen Rothenberg came in, but partly because it was a struggle to find anybody. Like we talked about Sunil Gulati getting in, just calling, and other people just calling and saying, hey, I want to be involved with this. And people say, great, come on in, because we need bodies, right? That's where U.S. soccer was prior. Allen Rothenberg comes in and I would say kind of professionalizes the organization a little bit more, better running, because he has, the business background. But as part of that, and part of this 2010, their focus really is on strengthening the national team, and specifically the men's national team. And, I think we have expanded beyond Project 2010 when we look now here in 2025 that we do much better with the women's team. And, we have all kinds of national, like beach football, and we have futsal, and we have our different, like I don't know if we have just a deaf team, but our different teams we have across the spectrum of abilities, both on the men's and the women's side. So there's some pretty positive things that have happened from our investing in our overall structure that really came out of this Project 2010 and deepened our player pool. But there were some other things when you look at it and the way they chose to focus that, again, we'll dive into in other episodes in this, because of our reliance heavily in sports in this country. The transition between youth sports and professional sports has always been the college game in almost every sport in this country. And because they had chosen, when they went MLS, to throw out the idea of promotion relegation and really never considered it again, at least not in anything public I've been able to find, other than a few people, around the ecosystem griping about it. It really was looking at the college game, but also understanding the college game was never going to get us there. Like, there needs to be something else. So, well, I'll get to my comment about that in a second. I want to get to a couple of things in his opening letter, and then, we'll get close to wrapping it up from there so we can dive into some of the other parts later. But in his opening letter, one of the things he stated is, of ideas, that it is paramount to establish the philosophy kind of what you want to do ultimately in terms of soccer culture in this country. And and then hire the best people to do that. But you need to have that plan. And one of the things Kirosh argued for, because of the size of our country, that our country demands a federation with the mentality of a confederation. That we can't treat it like most normal federations because of our size. And not just that that is a hindrance, but that also can be a positive for us if we think more in that mindset. And even though, as he said, ProRail is not mentioned anywhere in this document, Kirosh did warn that there needs to be a strong competitive infrastructure within the country. So hinting at promotional games and stuff. And if the game is not grown sufficiently at the local level, if it's not strong at the grassroots level, then any success that you end up having at the national level or international level is going to be artificial and fleeting and temporary, right? So if you don't have that base there, and there was a quote that kind of stood with me that I will read here. I got to zoom in on this because of my old eyes here. So he says, only when, so he's talking about right before this in his letter, he's also talking about like, yeah, we did poorly at the World Cup, but that happens. You could punch above your weight basically at the World Cup, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily that good. And I think this kind of goes to our US arrogance a little bit, because we make it a certain level and we think, okay, then that's the new low. We have to make it further and further each time. And his argument is you got to kind of take your World Cup wins and losses with a grain of salt and really look at the structure that's underneath, because you could have a great run, but it doesn't mean you have a great, soccer infrastructure. So he said, only when we improve all competition at the state and local levels will we raise the level of play throughout the United States. As the cream rises to the top, and to me, this is kind of, I'm sure he was mostly talking about players, but I feel like there's a hint of, even teams. And if we had a better structure for how the cream can rise to the top, but as the cream rises to the top, then and only then will we, the United States, experience in a systematic way meaningful improvement in the results and ability of the U.S. national team. So again, I think, to me, one of the huge misses of this Project 2010 was the I would say the lack of developing the professional game. It was recognizing college wasn't going to do it, but instead trying to create a national infrastructure of playing. So one of the results from Project 2010, which was good, is we have a much better system in place now, and since 2010, but it started the process of expanding our national programs, deepening our player pool, doing better with our coaches, and a vertical integration. So on that sense of identifying and bringing in players, from this we set up our under 17 residency program, which was our first attempt at really, looking at younger players and giving them a good solid environment to compete of what could be future national team players. So there are a lot of good things in Project 2010 about that. And then there was an interesting idea, like one of the things that was proposed was creating a national under 19 youth pro league. It was just under 19 youth pro league to help identify talent for the national team. It wasn't really, professional structure or pyramid structure. So this is where I think they kind of missed the mark. I think part of that missing the mark was because already by this time, we've thrown out promotion relegation. We put all our eggs in the MLS basket. And I think this is one of the things we look at in terms of this kind of pivotal shift. Plus, in 98, people, might not be old enough to remember, we had our huge financial crisis, which then is going to affect MLS over the next few years. So we have a bunch of things that kind of came together at once, hyper focus on the national team, hyper focus on Major League Soccer as the thing that would get us there. And then when things start to change also is the economic problems we have in 98 and losing of owners within MLS, where we get down to like 3 owners that own all the teams over the next few years. And that struggle to protect and grow MLS because that's where we put all our eggs in our strengthen our player pool. And you have this unbelievable crossover that started with Rothenberg of MLS and US soccer being in lockstep with each other. And I think this is where all this started, which people have complained about, and I think US soccer is untangling itself from MLS now, but you had so much crossover there, and then because of the financial crisis, that that need to protect, like if we were shooting for winning a World Cup in 2010 and this is our only professional league, we have to protect this at all costs. And I think that's kind of where we were as we leave 1998 and start into this phase of Project 2010. And once that really started, where we really locked into MLS, then US soccer certainly didn't help, in my opinion, grow the rest. And I think everything else kind of still grew in spite of all the hurdles. So to me, it's amazing that a league like USL that started in the mid 90s is still around in spite of everything that it's had against it. And that we have women's leagues and the women's semi-pro leagues that have been around forever in spite of all the hurdles and lack of support from US soccer, especially in, in the 90s and into the aughts.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I feel like you've covered most of it, but I think that the quickest way I can summarize why a closed system is bad for the national team is that you're gonna miss the Jamie Vardys of the world. And I don't even like Jamie Vardy. Like, he's a great player, but I think he's a bit of a prick. But like, he is the example of the kind of player you miss when you don't have an open system. And the reason I say that, and people went to, well, scouts will catch him, but like, that isn't really what happened. He worked his way up because he was successful at clubs that were doing well. And I think about players like Evan Conway or Nick Moon, who I personally think had the talent to play at the MLS level, right? But they were never given the chance, whether that's because scouts or coaches or whomever didn't agree with my assessment, and fair enough, they're professionals. But the thing with promotion and relegation is that they can earn that chance, right? Like, it doesn't require somebody else's opinion of them to be given that chance. Right. And that's why I think the closed system, it can help to raise the ceiling of the national team, but it doesn't raise the floor. And that's kind of what the U.S. men's team specifically is running into right now.
Yeah, I would agree completely on that. And I don't want to go any further. That's kind of where we wanted to go in this particular one. It's kind of give the background to get to Project 2010. And then I think we can devote some later on, come back and revisit, especially as timely topics come up within U.S. soccer now, but to look back at, how do we do with youth development? How do we do with professional development? How, why did some of these things that we may complain about now in 2025 in terms of U.S. soccer? Because we certainly do our share of complaining about U.S. soccer and how we think we should be moving more to an open pyramid. But how many of these things were set in motion for a variety of reasons? We prioritized. I think I would make the argument that prioritizing the 1994 World Cup pretty much above all else is what set in motion, because that's what got Allen Rothenberg hired as U.S. soccer president, and then the tremendous focus on our national teams to get there, and and creating, and the requirement then from FIFA was to create a first division team. So we had to rush to put these things together to show we could, and put on this event, put us on this course that we've been on that has neglected a lot of adult soccer in this country outside of Major League Soccer. There's been a huge emphasis on the youth level, but once you get to 18, 19, and college is there, and like I said, USL's been there in spite of everything, but on the men's side, there's a huge gap. There's a huge gap between Major League Soccer and the youth level that's not being filled. right? And it should be.
Yeah, definitely. That bridge is so important.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's as I said, that's what we had. Let's go ahead and wrap this up for this particular episode. Dylan, any particular soccer plans coming up for the week?
Not in particular. Will watch Premier League. Maybe catch the end of this Canadian Championship game, depending on how that's going. Although it looks like it's not going great. So yeah, I don't know. I haven't looked ahead at the schedule, to be honest.
Yeah, I haven't looked too far at the schedule. I'm sure I'll catch some games this weekend, but I'm looking forward to the draw for the U.S. Open Cup, the 2026 Open Cup qualifying tournament, and looking to see if we can set some dates to check out some of our San Diego teams in play. So
Definitely.
I really hope that of the 4 games, the 2 games that we have, they'll be on different days instead of playing at the same time. But we'll see what happens and see if we can organize something. So I'm looking forward to that. That's probably the thing I'm looking forward to the most, and chance to get out there and see some soccer here, local soccer in the next few weeks that ties directly to the Open Cup.
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. Well, that's going to wrap up another episode of the LGS Pod for us. If you have a question or comment about tonight's show, please drop us a note. You can always do so here on YouTube. Leave us the comments as you normally do here on the channel, or social media. You can reach us on Blue Sky. We are at soccershorts@bigpinedigital.com. Or if you're listening to the app on your podcast app, you can send us a text using the send us a text link at the top of the episode description. We always appreciate your comments and your feedback, and we certainly got quite a bit last week when I misspoke about Project 10 and when it actually started. So
that's funny. I was just reading something funny today. Someone saying that when they need advice for an IT thing, instead of posting asking for help, what they'll do is they'll post asking for help and then log into a different account and respond to that post with incorrect information, because people are always people are always a lot more motivated to correct somebody than they are to answer a question.
Yeah, that's true. I don't know, maybe we'll have to get in and start our own comments.
Yeah, right, exactly. Engagement based.
All right. Dylan, any last comments before we actually head out?
No, it's Vancouver's up 2-0 now, so I think we may have jumped the gun a little bit on that one.
Yeah, well, too bad. Maybe Forge can mount a comeback. We'll see. All right. Thanks everyone for joining us on another episode of Local Grassroots Stories. Good night, and we'll see everyone next week.